Okay. This is a shir on Likutei Sichos, 28th book, Chelek of Ches, the Sicha of Shelach, the second Sicha. In this Sicha, we're going to take a deep dive into a story that seems so simple, yet we will discover that there's so much nuance to the story, there's so much depth. And let's see, let's jump in. In the end of our parsha, the portion of Shelach, Rashi brings from Rabbi Moshe, the Darshan, literally it means Rabbi Moshe, the expounder. Why is the story of the gathering of the wood on Shabbos? Why is it placed next to the story of the prohibition of idolatry to tell us that when one violates the Shabbos, one should know that it's like he committed idolatry? Because just like idolatry, one understands, it's self-understood that one violates the prohibition of idolatry, one is violating the entire code of the Torah. If you don't believe in God, that means you're denying the whole Torah. Similarly, the importance of keeping Shabbos is such that if somebody violates the Shabbos, he's also denying the Torah in a sense, just like idolatry. So that's why there's the juxtaposition of these two stories at the end of the parsha. We have the prohibition against idolatry, the Torah tells us, and then the Torah tells us a story. The story it tells us is that there was somebody going in the desert, and they found a person collecting wood on Shabbos. Prohibition. Yeah. So because he was doing that, he had to be put to death. So Rashi brings that what's the reason for the juxtaposition, idolatry and Shabbos, to tell you that violating Shabbos is in a way as central as committing the sin of idolatry. So the Tosfos we know is a group of rabbis in around the 11th, or maybe 10th century, 11th century, whatever it is. So the Tosfos brings that the story of the Mekoshes, the story of the violation of Shabbos, was at the beginning of the 40 years, right after the story of the spies. So let's just regain our historical context here. The Jews left Egypt in the first of what was to become 40 years. They were supposed to go straight into Israel after 1 year, get the Torah 50 days after leaving Egypt, spend a year at Sinai, and then go straight into Israel. In the end, what happened is they landed up falling into the trap of believing the negative report that the spies, the Meraglim, that the spies gave about Israel, and they complained and cried all night. And Hashem said, "You don't want to go to Israel? You won't go to Israel, but I'm not going to kill you just like that. I'm going to let you live your full life to the age of 60, and after 39 additional years in the desert, by the time everybody's 60, anybody who's 20 and violated, by the time they turn 60, that generation will die out, the kids will go in." So what we're saying now is, and that happened the second year that they were in the desert, and then there's the rest of the 40 years. So the Tosfos says that this story of the violator of the Shabbos, the Mekoshesh, the one gathering wood, took place right at that second year. Okay, why? What's the significance? He says because there was a notion that once Hashem had delayed the journey to Israel for 40 years, there was a notion that some said, you know what? God is delaying the whole purpose of Torah is to be lived in Israel. So if we're not in Israel and God delayed the Israel part, God also delayed the obligation that we have to study Torah. The mitzvahs don't apply till we get to Israel. So he said, "Oh no way, we're not going to buy this narrative. Watch what will happen." He got up, he did something that violated the Shabbos, and he said, "You're going to see what happens. They're not going to let me live. I'm going to get punished from God. I'm going to get hauled to court, and they're going to kill me. In this way, he will make a point. Everybody will now know that the mitzvahs are applicable in the desert to the pain of, if you don't listen to certain mitzvahs, there's a death penalty, just like there will be in Israel." So that's why this parsha starts with the story of the spies. The outcome is that the Jews get delayed in the desert 40 years, and then the Mekoshesh Eitzim, the gatherer of the woods who violates Shabbos, his story is told at the end of this parasha because his story is exact, it correlates and is a continuation of the story of the spies. It's here to tell us that he made a point. Torah mitzvahs is very, very applicable. Okay, now, if that is the case, really we have the reason for juxtaposition for placing the story of the spies and right after that the story of the Shabbos violation. Why is there a talk about idolatry between those two topics? So the Gemara explains. Which leads us to say that there is somehow a connection between idolatry and the discussion about the violation of Shabbos that we're talking about here. And the Gemara says that Moshe Rabbeinu knew that this violator of Shabbos needs to be killed. You see, the pasuk says, the Torah says, Moshe Rabbeinu locked him up because he wasn't sure what to do with him. So the Gemara says he knew that there's a death penalty. He wasn't sure what form of death. There's four ways that based in carries out a death penalty. Moshe wasn't sure which of the four methods. But he knew that that there is a death penalty. However, the Gemara says he was thinking wasn't sure, maybe because violating Shabbos is like violating idolatry, maybe there should be stoning. The same way Shabbos, somebody who violates idolatry is stoned, put to death by stoning. Perhaps somebody who violates Shabbos should also be put to death that way because of the correlation between Shabbos and idolatry. By the way, what is the correlation? So Rashi says, Rabbi here in a footnote says, Rashi says in the tractate of Chulin that, when somebody violates idolatry, what he's doing is denying the centrality and the supremacy of God, right? So what does somebody who doesn't keep Shabbos do? If he's flagrantly and deliberately violating Shabbos, he's saying that I don't believe in this whole story of God creating heaven and earth and resting on the Shabbos. He's basically denying that Hashem rested on the seventh day, and it's basically in a sense denying God. He's denying creation, denying God, denying that whole involvement of God in the creation, of creating 6 days and resting on the seventh. So there's something very central to Shabbos. So, which leads us again to say that the story of the spies, the violation of the prohibition against idolatry, and the story where this person violates Shabbos somehow are interconnected. And we could add that this connection is this connection between idolatry and violating Shabbos is not just that they're connected in general, because if you deny Shabbos, you're really denying God, just like idolatry in some way. But the detail of the violation here is, what's the detail of the violation here? The detail of the violation is that he meant good. The person violating the Shabbos here actually had an intention, a positive intention. He wanted to make himself an example so that the Jewish people should pay heed. So it would seem that the connection between idolatry and the story of the Shabbos violation is going to be somehow tied to the unique violation of Shabbos here, which the unique violation of the Shabbos here is that it wasn't a spiteful violation. It was actually a purposeful violation. So let's just leave that in our head and we'll come back to it. We'll see how can you violate the Shabbos on one hand and yet there's a purpose. You're trying to promote God's mitzvahs on the other hand. It's a little bit confusing. And also, because this is all part of the portion of Shelach, which mainly talks about the spies, obviously it's going to tie into the story of the spies, and the Rebbe is going to weave a tapestry and a beautiful interwoven connection between all these topics. Paragraph 2. So we'll understand this by first understanding an explanation that is given in the words of the Medrash that the Tosfos brings. The Tosfos says that he intended for the sake of heaven, because the Jews were saying that it's been decreed upon them not to go into Israel because of the story of the spies. Now the Jews are no longer obligated to mitzvahs, so he got up and violated the Shabbos in order that he should be killed, and everybody will understand that the mitzvahs are very much applicable even in the desert. Now, if he wanted to make a point like that, why didn't he violate another mitzvah? Why did he violate the Shabbos? Why didn't he, for example, do another mitzvah where he'd get lashes? There's many, many mitzvahs like eating non kosher food. You could eat a non kosher piece of something, davar acher, some other species that's not kosher, eat a sizzling steak, and then he'll get punished, he'll get lashes. Everybody will see the laws apply. Why did he do a violation which caused him death? Because the problem with death is that death is its own when somebody brings about their own death, this is something that's itself sinful. So he did a sin which is the worst sin to do because it led to his death, which is even a sin as well. Why did he just choose a sin that can prove that the mitzvahs apply? Targum Yonasan, the which is also called Targum Shalmi, he says that the when he says that the person intended to violate the Shabbos for the sake of heaven to prove that mitzvahs are still viable and applicable, he says because they knew that there's a prohibition of Shabbos. They didn't know that there's going to be a punishment for Shabbos. And now they get to know about the severity of Shabbos from the punishment that they're going to carry out on this person himself. But the Medrash doesn't seem to speak about the fact that he was trying to prove what the punishment is. The Medrash just says he was trying to prove that mitzvahs are applicable. If that's the case, we come back to our original question. Why don't we just say, why didn't he violate something else? Not as radical as the Shabbos and make his point. And they'll give him the 39 lashes, like the punishment is for many of the prohibitions of the Torah, and he'll make his point. But the explanation is, according to the words of the Maharsha lived approximately a little bit more than 400 years ago, one of the great commentators on the Gemara. And the Maharsha wrote about this question. He says, you know why he violated the Shabbos? Because um, this because he had an intention. What was his intention in violating the Shabbos? Not to gather the wood. The actual prohibited work that he did on Shabbos was not his intention. He didn't want the wood. What was he trying to do? He was trying to bring himself to be liable to the death penalty so that everybody should see what is the death penalty on Shabbos and that their mitzvahs are applicable, that there is still reward and punishment and obligation even in the desert. 1 second. If that's his intention was never for the work he was doing. So we know that there's a halacha. Listen to this basic premise of Shabbos. If somebody does what's called malacha, she'ena tzericha legufa, somebody does work on Shabbos that he doesn't need for the actual work. For example, if somebody is digging a hole, you're not allowed to dig a hole on Shabbos. But if he digs a hole because he wants the hole, violates the Shabbos. So what happens if he digs a hole because he wants the earth? What happens if he's filling sandbags because he's worried about flying grass? He's in a time of, well, if it's danger to life, he doesn't have to worry about Shabbos. Well, it's not danger to life. He's filling sandbags for some reason, and he wants some sand. So he shovels some sand and he creates a hole. The hole is not his intention. The hole is the violation, but that wasn't his intention. His intention was putting the sand in the bags is not a violation. So now we have his intention is to do something permissible. What happens automatically is actually something prohibited. He's created this trench. You're not allowed to make a trench on Shabbos on the ground. So there is an opinion. Rabbi Shimon says he's not liable for punishment. You're not allowed to do it in the first place, but you can't get punished for that because punishment on Shabbos for violating Shabbos has to be a full violation. Full violation is only when you did it with the full intention and you had a need for the actual violation you were creating. You made a trench for the trench. So now if this guy doesn't actually need the wood, he wants to get into trouble for Shabbos so that he should get punished. He doesn't even want the wood he's collecting, which means to say that he really didn't violate the Shabbos. So he's able to do a sin He did a sin where he made a point, but because he wasn't doing the sin for the sake of the sin, he didn't wasn't interested in the violation that he was doing. He had no need for that wood. He was just trying to get the outcome. Getting the outcome is not a violation of Shabbos. So he actually didn't violate Shabbos. Paragraph 3, but 1 second. Why did Hashem say put him to death? Stone him. He didn't violate the Shabbos. Hashem knows his intention. He wanted just to prove that the Shabbos is still applicable. He's going to get punished. So the Maharsha says, you know why he's still punished? Why Hashem says he has to get punished? Because the witnesses didn't know that this was his intention. The witnesses had no idea that he said, yes, I'm violating the Shabbos. He wanted them to put him to, he wanted to be punished to make his point that everybody should see that the Shabbos is still applicable in the desert, right? So he goes and he says, hey, look what I'm doing. I'm about to violate the Shabbos. In order to be put to death, you need witnesses to come and say, you're not allowed to do that. You know you're not allowed to do that. He says, I know I'm not allowed to do it. I'm still doing it. Then they haul him to court, and now he has to be put to death. Hashem knows that he didn't really do it. He didn't need the wood, which means he wasn't really liable. So why does Hashem say to put him to death? Because the Torah is because the witnesses and the court doesn't know what his intention was. So 1 second, but Hashem does know. So why does Hashem, who's truth, say he should be put to death? Because we have to understand that the obligation to put somebody to death when they violate flagrantly and deliberately, they have to be warned, they have to be told, you sure you know what you're doing? It's basically a huge spitefulness to Hashem to get punished like that. We know that the punishments, according to the truthful Torah, the authentic Torah is authentic and true. Torah says it goes after deeds, after actions. If you did an action of Shabbos violation, and in the externals, in your speech, and in the way you were warned, and the way you reacted to that warning was that you know, and you're deliberately violating the Shabbos, then it doesn't matter what you were thinking deep down. Hashem knows it. It doesn't matter what you were thinking. That person has to be put to death. However, um, however, he, knowing his true intention, knew that he was doing something that wasn't really a Shabbos violation. So we ask, why didn't he do something else why didn't he do something else that showed the mitzvahs are a violation? You know why? Let's think about this. If he would have eaten a piece of non-kosher steak to show and then got beaten, the sin would be a real sin. He ate the steak. He didn't want to sin. He wanted just to be an example to others that the mitzvahs still apply, and if he does sin, there's punishment. But he didn't want to actually flagrantly be spiteful to God. So what did he do? He did a mitzvah, and this is the only mitzvah which you can do that outwardly it looks like he did something wrong, and that's why he'll get punished, which is what he wanted. But because he was doing it just for the effect, he actually, in an ironic way, didn't actually violate the Shabbos. Between him and Hashem, the deed that he did was not biblically prohibited because he didn't do it with the intention of the wood. You understand the beautiful chap he had? He's going to do something which, because he knows that he's doing it only for a different reason, Hashem is not going to consider it spiteful. The point he wants to make, where Hashem is going to say you have to be punished because in this world you have to look not at intentions, you have to look at deeds. He'll get punished. The Jews will now know that that the mitzvahs apply very strongly, even in the desert. Paragraph 4, according to this, we'll also understand the connection between the gatherer of the wood, the violator of the Shabbos, and the description before that in the Torah about the prohibition of idolatry. Why? Because we find something about idolatry that is different than all the other mitzvahs. We find that when it comes to giving up your life, to withstanding the temptation or the test of idolatry, Jews, even the simplest Jews, give up their life not to even do an outward deed that would seem idolatrous. Even though Obviously, the person doesn't believe in the idol. So when the Cossack or when the says either bow to the cross or I'll kill you, why does the Jew not just bow? He knows he doesn't believe in the cross and Yoshke and all that, but he doesn't because even outwardly he's not prepared to sever himself from Hashem. Well, why not? I mean, the main violation of idolatry is not to believe in idolatry, right? Not to take anything upon you as a god, not to believe in anything but the oneness of Hashem. But if the person doesn't even believe in idols, so what if he bows to it? But obviously, what we see is that when it comes to idolatry, a Jew will not even outwardly associate with anything that shows he's cut off from Hashem, and he gives up his life for that. And that's the connection between the wood gatherer here and idolatry. There's a difference here. When it comes to the work of Shabbos, the whole thing, the real violation of Shabbos is when you do a productive work with full mindfulness and intention. It says that Hashem, that we have a rule about the laws of Shabbos, that meleches machsheves asatera. Hashem prohibited, the Torah prohibited intentional work. So that if somebody did, as I said, he filled up bags with sand because he wanted the sand, that unintentionally a trench was created, that's not mindful, intentional work that he's liable for a desecration of Shabbos. Nonetheless, since outwardly his deed was a violation of Shabbos, because he wasn't filling sandbags. He was engaged with the wood as if he needed the wood. We know, Hashem knew that he didn't really want the wood, but outwardly he was doing a prohibited agenda. So according to the Torah, just like idolatry, you do it outward, you bow, it's a problem, even though inwardly you don't believe. Similarly here, this person's Shabbos violation was an outward violation, but because the Torah works down here in this world, we can't go into the mind of the person unless his deed indicates what's in his mind. In other words, in the sandbags, he's filling up sandbags, so you see he didn't intend to dig a trench. That wasn't his intention. So in that case, we know that it's not a mindful malacha. But in our case, he was gathering wood and it looked, for all intents and purposes, like he was doing it to be spiteful and violate Shabbos. So just like idolatry, if you're not allowed to bow even outwardly, Shabbos also, it's a violation if outwardly it looks fully like you did a productive malacha, you did something that violated the Shabbos. Now, paragraph 5. Now, based on this, we'll understand the connection to the story of the spies in the deeper content, in the meaning of what was going on with this spy story. It's explained in various places. The reason that the spies wanted to stay in the desert and they didn't want to go into Israel is because the main occupation of the Jews in the desert, they didn't have to be occupied with making a living. They had manna from heaven. Their clothes were refurbished and laundered with the clouds of glory. They had water from the well of Miriam. They didn't need anything. So what was they going to do in the desert when a Jew has nothing to do? I'm going to make a sad joke. There was no Wi-Fi in the desert. What do you do? What does a Jew do when he doesn't have to, when everything's provided for him and there's no Wi-Fi to distract him? He studies Torah. So they were very happy in that life ensconced in Torah. What is Torah all about? Understanding, speaking, but not so much deed. Just basically sit and study. Going into Israel represented a descent into the world of menial labor, of hard plowing and planting and harvesting. They didn't want that. In Israel, the main form of serving Hashem is real life, which is deed, right? Action-based mitzvahs. Especially in Israel, there's so many mitzvahs that are hinged, especially in Israel. Got to do with the land, that lands, but many many mitzvahs, the resting of the land, the tithing, and so on. So they wanted to go along with the narrative of the spies not to go into Israel. They said what they were saying on a deeper level was this land is not good. It consumes its inhabitants, they say. There's a verse there. Eretz ochelet yoshveh. They were saying that the earthliness consumes the people. They're all involved in menial labor. They can't sit for 30 hours a day just studying, involved in spirituality. If that's what the spies were mistakenly saying, now we understand why the Medrash says that the Jews were after the story of the spies, the Jews were under the notion that since they're not going to go into Israel because of what happened with the spies, there's no obligation of mitzvahs anymore. In other words, they thought that they're not obligated to do the practical mitzvahs anymore. Now, why not? If they would have said, because we're meant to die, so you can say, because we're meant to die, maybe, maybe we're already like considered dead. So what's the purpose of doing mitzvahs? It's hard to see how that would make sense, but at least you could, but they don't say, when they say maybe there's no mitzvahs, the reasoning they're giving is because of the story of the spies. And we're not going into Israel, so maybe we're not obligated to mitzvahs. They didn't say because we're going to die prematurely, maybe we're not obligated to mitzvahs. As if, because they're going to die, maybe they just don't have to do anything now. They can just lie down and do nothing. No, they're saying because we had the story of the spies and we're not going into Israel, maybe we don't have to do mitzvahs. What's the connection between going into Israel and do mitzvahs? But based on what we just explained, there is a big, big correlation. Because what they were thinking is that if Hashem wanted to take us into Israel, the main thing about Israel was to do the mitzvahs. And we messed up and we complained and we're not going into Israel. So maybe Hashem has delayed that implementation of mitzvahs, which really is meant to start in Israel. So maybe the first year we left Egypt, we were building up to it. But now that we know it's pushed off till the end of 40 years, maybe the whole plan of action-based Judaism hasn't started yet. Got canceled. Ah, maybe all we're meant to do now is really what we asked for. We were scared to go into Israel because we didn't want to get involved into the world of deed and the world of the menial stuff. And we made a mistake. Hashem wanted us there. Okay, now he's not taking us there. Maybe now he's saying, okay, you guys are a lost case. You just live your life of spirituality. I don't need your deeds. I don't forget about it. So that's why this wood gatherer comes and he violated the Shabbos to show, no, you watch, he says. He's going to get killed and others will see that it's very real. Hashem does want Torah to be lived, even in the desert, in the world of deed. And even in those things where usually you only violate when it's intentional work, and he did it, this prohibition, for a higher purpose. In other words, he didn't do it as a mindful prohibition because he didn't need the wood. So really, yet you will see that because I violated, he says, because he violated in action, Hashem will put him to death. Which means that action, even in the desert, action is, in Judaism, action is at the top. Action is what counts most, even in the desert, before they go into Israel. And this taught the Jews that were then alive in the desert till the end of the time, till they've all passed away, that when they were 60, at the end of 40 years, that they didn't go there, they're not going into Israel, I mean, they're not going to reach the highest level of practical mitzvahs, which can only be carried out in Israel. But even while they're in the desert, Hashem has a plan that he wants mitzvahs to be done here physically in actual practicality. However much you can do it in the desert. Because the main thing of mitzvah, the word mitzvah is a commandment, and the word mitzvah is also tzavta, connection. The main connection we have with Hashem is through his instruction to us to do practical mitzvahs. It's the practical mitzvah that builds the connection. Hashem says, put on tefillah. Hashem says, eat kosher. Hashem says, light Shabbos candles. Doing that action makes the connection between us and Hashem. Even in the desert. Of course, how much more so now? We're not in the desert. And that is the explanation. We tied everything together. How the story of the spies, which was a story that maybe had the Jews thinking that initially they made a mistake thinking that deed is not important. Now they come back and they realize that it is, but still they're not sure. Maybe only once they get into Israel. Comes the Mekoshes, the wood gas. Then we have the instruction about idolatry, because idolatry, even if it's only outward, is a violation. Just like in our case, the Shabbos, usually if the Shabbos is only outward, it's not a violation, because Shabbos, you're only violated if you do something mindful. But in this case, the non-mindfulness that our wood gatherer, this Makosha Sheitzim had, wasn't known, couldn't be known to anybody in the world of deed. In the world of deed, he violated. He violated and intentionally, but he didn't really violate to God because he didn't need the thing he was doing. So he, to God, was not spiteful. Hashem had him killed because in the world of deed, he did a misdemeanor. He needed to be killed. And in this way, he proved to the Bnei Yisrael that deed reigns supreme. So what we who did go into Yisrael and we're in the next stage, of course, we also always have to understand that in Yiddishkeit, the Maisa mitzvah, the deed of the mitzvah is uppermost. Thank you.